Welcome to the Clegg series, When Black Men Ruled the World. In this set of tapes, we shall reveal little-known or acknowledged facts of history about black people in ancient times. On the cover of its issue of January 1988, Newsweek magazine carried a painting of a young black couple flanking the biblical tree of life. The picture was captioned, "The Search for Adam and Eve." Newsweek has revealed what many scientists and scholars now believe, that Africa was the birthplace of the human family, that the first members of what we now describe as the modern human race were black Africans, and that all human beings around the world share common roots in prehistoric Africa. In other words, we all stem from the same African family tree. For thousands of years, the only people on Earth were Africans. They migrated throughout the great continent and made many discoveries along the way. They learned to domesticate animals, to cultivate crops, and to build shelters for protection against the elements. They also organized themselves into families, clans, and tribes. During what is called the Pleistocene Age, which ended about 10,000 years ago, the region which is now referred to as the Sahara had a climate much cooler and wetter than it is today. This part of Africa was covered with grasslands and forests, as well as a number of lakes and streams. Elephants, giraffes, and other animals roamed the land, which was also populated by a highly advanced black people whose prehistoric rock paintings, still visible today, provide a clear image of life during that time. By 7000 BC, the once fertile region, which we call the Sahara, had dried up, and most black people who lived there migrated toward the upper regions of the Nile Valley in the interior of Africa. Other people, also fleeing the spreading desert, traveled further south or headed northward in the direction of the Mediterranean Sea. Part one of our series begins with the people who settled along the Nile Valley. As we shall see, the Nile River extends over 4,000 miles from its beginning near the heart of the African continent northward to the Mediterranean Sea. The southernmost portions of the Nile, which are closest to its origins, are called the Upper Nile, while the northern reaches of the river near the Mediterranean Sea are called the Lower Nile. The entire length of the Nile River extends through the continent of Africa. In other words, no portion of this great river crosses Europe, Asia, or any other land mass. All of the great civilizations that sprang from the Nile were also located on the continent of Africa. The saga you are about to witness will take you back to the ancient Nile, to Nubia and Egypt, the first great nations on Earth. It is a summary of that faraway, now almost forgotten, golden age in the history of black people. It was a time when black pharaohs and queens did indeed rule the civilized world of their day, and the achievements of these ancient people have had an important impact on modern society. Let us now turn to part one of the Clegg series, Egypt during the Golden Age. The Nile River, rising out of the interior of Africa, rushes down the mountains on its journey to the Mediterranean Sea. On its way, it carries precious fertile earth, which it deposits on its banks. For a few miles on each side of the Nile, there is a green belt that quickly melts into the surrounding desert. About 10,000 years ago, people began migrating toward the Nile and ultimately drifting into and settling its fruitful plain. An ancient and proud people who would build a great civilization, who would create an empire that would extend into the interior of Africa, engulf Asia Minor, embrace the Middle East, and influence the entire Mediterranean world. These ancient people would build monuments of great magnitude and splendor, monuments that would be the envy of the ancient world, monuments that would serve as the blueprint and foundation for modern civilization. They also invented law and mathematics, science, writing, music, and agriculture. Who were these people? Where did they come from? Strong evidence indicates that they came from the south, from a country through which the Nile flows, from the land of Nubia, or what we call the northern Sudan in Africa. It was only natural for ancient explorers to follow the Nile River in order to find where it was going, and in doing that, to settle along its banks and to ultimately found a great and thriving civilization. The Nubians of antiquity stated that Egypt was a colony of their land, and that the Egyptians derived their laws and customs from their Nubian cousins to the south. A number of scholars hold this opinion today.
The pharaonic civilization that later came to characterize ancient Egypt had already existed in what we call Nubia for at least 300 years before the first dynasty. Now, as far as I'm concerned, Egypt and Nubia were part of the same cultural complex. There was no essential cultural, linguistic, ethnic, or racial difference between them. The differences, such as they were in the manner of regional differences, much as the difference you might find in England between, say, an Englishman and a Welshman, in the Central Europe between a German and an Austrian, in Italy between an Italian, for example, and a Sicilian. So even though these are regional variations, if you will, they still belong to the same general civilization complex. So did Egypt and Nubia, and the Egyptians themselves said so. They themselves knew that their civilization derived from the southern part of their, south of their borders, and they knew that it derived from what we call Nubia, or Ethiopia. So civilization itself descends the Nile from Inner Africa. If you will, it crystallizes in Nubia, and then reaches its highest and final form in the land called Kemet, or ancient Egypt, over a period of 4,000 years of unbroken Egyptian civilization.
Modern evidence appears to confirm the tradition that civilization traveled northward from Nubia into Egypt. Skulls and skeletons unearthed in Nubia and Egypt are of the same or similar African racial type. Some of the most ancient paintings and drawings of Nubians and Egyptians also depict them as a distinctly African people. As Dr. Finch has noted, Egypt's general political structure and divine kingship appear to have been modeled after the Tasseri dynasty of Nubia that preceded that of Egypt by over 200 years. In other words, there were pharaohs ruling Nubia long before Egypt became a nation. Some scientists insist that pyramid building also began in Nubia and was refined and perfected after the Nubians moved northward and settled in Egypt. Even mummification appears to have started in Nubia and to have spread northward into Egypt 500 years after it was invented. Nubia was also considered the land of the gods and the spiritual home of the Egyptian people. Perhaps that is why the chief beneficent gods and goddesses of Egypt, such as Osiris and Isis, were depicted as blacks. Finally, during all of her periods of upheaval, chaos, and foreign invasions, Egypt was rescued and reunited by powerful black men from the Nubian south. This was true of the Mentuhoteps in the Middle Kingdom. It was true of Ahmose I in the New Kingdom, and it was true of Pianki and Taharqa during the 25th dynasty. Although not all scientists and scholars agree, the weight of evidence certainly points toward a black origin of Egyptian civilization. In time, of course, Asians and Europeans settled Lower Egypt near the Mediterranean Sea and ultimately intermingled with the native black population. Nevertheless, Egypt's cultural, physical, and spiritual legacy was chiefly derived from the black Nubian South. This no doubt explains why, in later years, the visiting Hebrews, Greeks, Romans, and others described the ancient Egyptians as black-skinned with close curled hair. The distinguished writer, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, captured the opinions of the ancients when he wrote, "We conclude, therefore, that the Egyptians were Negroid, and not only that, but by tradition they believed themselves descended, not from the whites or the yellows, but from the black people of the South. Thence they traced their origin, and toward the South in earlier days, they turned the faces of their buried corpses." Du Bois might also have added that the Egyptians themselves called their country Kemet, which many scholars interpret as land of the blacks. Now that we've learned about the origin of these ancient people, let us see how Egypt became a great African nation. Because of the surrounding desert, Egypt was shielded from invasion for thousands of years. During that time, various people who occupied the Nile Valley began working together. The Nile overflowed its banks every year. Controlling the river was important if the people wanted to grow food successfully. The Egyptians first formed villages that cooperated with each other. Cooperation led to organization, and organization led to the building of a great nation. A little over 5,000 years ago, another important step took place. At that time, the nation was divided into two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt. A black man, Narmer, united the two lands into one. This followed a war in which Narmer's troops defeated Asian immigrants who had settled in Lower Egypt. Narmer became the first pharaoh or king of Egypt, following the great kings of Ta-Seti in Nubia. This pharaoh began the rule of what is called the dynasty, which is a line of kings and queens of the same family. Narmer had a glorious reign of 62 years. One of his greatest achievements was diverting the Nile River and creating the delta where he built the city of Memphis. This was the beginning of Egypt's golden age. Little is known of the pharaohs who followed Narmer during the first and second dynasties. Some of them, such as King Kasakam and King Paa-Neneter, appear to have been stern and powerful men. During the reigns of these pharaohs, Egyptian society evolved into classes. First, there were the peasants or laborers. Then came the builders, artists, jewelers, and other skilled workers. After them were the warriors, priests, and officials. Finally, there was the pharaoh or king. The women of Egypt were also an integral part of the society. Many of them engaged in the same labor that men did, and they had equal opportunity to own, manage, and receive property. There were also many prominent women in ancient Egypt, some of whom reigned during the Golden Age.
Women in particular. You have a woman whose name is Hetepheres. She is the great royal wife of Sneferu, who commissioned 3 massive pyramids, and the mother of Khufu. But in the 6th dynasty, at the end of the 6th dynasty, you have a woman known as Nitocris, and she's spoken of specifically by Herodotus as being a pharaoh, and also the person who commissioned the 3rd of the great pyramid projects at Giza. And she's called the loveliest and fairest woman of her time.
The most renowned Egyptian women ruled during the Middle and New Kingdoms. A few were even as powerful as the great pharaohs themselves. Other women were content to exercise their influence behind the throne. Let us move ahead now to the 3rd dynasty. By this time, Egypt was well on its way to becoming the extraordinary nation it was destined to be. Many of its achievements were staggering. For example, Imhotep, the brilliant philosopher, architect, and scientist, also became the true father of medicine. Through his influence, the Egyptians developed antiseptics, vaccinations, and advanced surgical techniques, and they found cures for numerous diseases. In short, the Egyptians laid the foundation for modern medical science.
Scientific medicine begins in ancient Egypt. That is to say, if we look at the Edwin Smith surgical papyrus, I call it the founding document of scientific medicine anywhere in the world. From the point of view of the sciences that we call if we call the related disciplines of medical science, that is anatomy, physiology, pathology, pharmacology, those were organized as coherent scientific disciplines first in ancient Egypt. The first medical schools were built and erected in ancient Egypt. The first organized system of instruction and of teaching were first established in ancient Egypt. The first surgery, the first neurosurgery, the first investigations into cardiovascular physiology, all this began in the ancient kingdom of the Nile in the northeast quadrant of Africa 6,000 years ago. In fact, so well known was ancient Egypt's primacy in the area of medical science that Hippocrates would have never had the audacity to have called himself the father of medicine, because he knew better. He would have said, as Homer did, that in medicine, Egypt leaves the rest of the world behind. That was accepted as a matter of fact in the ancient world throughout ancient Egypt's 4,000-year history. All of the ancient Greeks who made a name for themselves in medicine studied in Egypt.
The Egyptians also now appear to have developed their own legal system with scribes and judges, long before the nation of Greece, which was once thought to have been the seat of Western law, was born. What is more, the Egyptians invented the hieroglyphic writing system, they produced the first clock and calendar, and they introduced agricultural science to the ancient world. Above all else, though, Egypt is known for its pyramids, the bulk of which were also constructed during the Golden Age. First, there was the step pyramid of Saqqara, built by Imhotep during the Third Dynasty. This is the oldest large stone structure in the world. Originally, other buildings and courtyards were constructed near the step pyramid, and this entire complex was enclosed by a wall 1,500 feet long by 900 feet wide. Today, however, the only prominent remaining structure is the step pyramid. King Sneferu of the Fourth Dynasty built the so-called Bent Pyramid several miles south of Saqqara. This structure has no steps, but is straight-sided except for a change of angle in the middle. Finally, there was the Great Pyramid, built for the pharaoh Khufu, whom the Greeks called Cheops, also during the Fourth Dynasty. The Great Pyramid, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, is indeed a magnificent monument to contemplate. Still standing today, it originally rose 481 feet and is estimated to have contained 2,300,000 blocks of stone. The area it covers is large enough to hold the cathedrals of Florence, Milan, and St. Peter's in Rome, as well as St. Paul's and Westminster Abbey in London. The Great Pyramid contains enough stone to construct 30 Empire State Buildings. If all the stones in the pyramid were sawed into blocks 1 foot on an edge and then were laid end to end, they would stretch 2/3 of the way around the globe at the equator. There are about 80 pyramids remaining in Egypt and 100 in Nubia, or what is today called the Northern Sudan. Although scientists are not certain of the purpose of these ancient structures, it is widely believed that they served as tombs for members of the Egyptian royal family. We have looked at the black origin of the ancient Egyptians, and we've spoken of their major achievements. Now let us turn to the pharaohs who governed this great nation during the Golden Age. There were many rulers of the Third Dynasty, the most prominent of whom was Zoser. During his reign of 19 years, Egypt's borders were extended into the interior of Africa. Copper mines were exploited in the Sinai. Extensive construction took place, and the step pyramid was built. The Fourth Dynasty also brought forth a line of great black pharaohs, some of whose names we have mentioned. Sneferu was a distinguished ruler who successfully defeated the Nubians and Libyans in battle. He also constructed vessels nearly 170 feet long. He was a kind and gentle monarch. His successors were Khufu, during whose reign the Great Pyramid was built, Dedefre, whose pyramid was erected north of Giza at Abu Rash, Khafre, builder of the Second Great Pyramid, and whose facial likeness is found in the mysterious Sphinx, and Menkaure, a just and forthright ruler whose spiritual temperament prompted many to worship him as a god. The first 4 dynasties of ancient Egypt represented a time of unprecedented splendor and glory. It was the technological high point of the black race.
The Old Kingdom is a great pyramid building age. It's an age of great stability in Egypt, of great internal construction projects. I think that when we look at the Old Kingdom, once again, we're looking at the first physicians, such as Imhotep. You're looking at the massive construction projects. You're looking at the internal stability. You look in the Sixth Dynasty when the pyramids were still being constructed at the reign of Pepi II, who reigned for 94 years. Here's a man who, here's a boy who was 10 years old when he became the king of Kemet, dies at the age of 104. And that tells us that these people knew a great deal about science, about medicine.
The 5th and 6th dynasties still witnessed Egyptian supremacy in the ancient world, but a gradual decline set in that would pick up momentum at the close of the period. The names and personalities of the 5th dynasty kings remain a mystery because many of them are only known by their statues. Yet it is clear that a number of these rulers were both efficient and adventurous. For example, they formed strong navies that braved the seas and spread Egyptian culture abroad. This has prompted many scholars to ask, during the course of their long history, did the ancient Egyptians sail to the New World before Columbus? The Egyptians had sturdy ships that may have made the journey. Numerous Africoid sculptures suggest an ancient black presence in the New World. Even Mexican pyramids, hieroglyphs, and cultural artifacts provide strong evidence that the Egyptians sailed to the Americas in ancient times.
It's evident, without going into a lot of scientific and technical detail, that they knew that the Earth was round. They knew that the Earth was tilted on its axis. They knew that the Earth revolved around the sun. They had already had ways of determining the minute, the minute of arc in the heavens of movement of stars. So they had already learned how to determine celestial longitude and terrestrial longitude and latitude. So they would have had more than enough astronomical knowledge to enable them to navigate almost anywhere in the world. And they would have had craft, that is watercraft, seaworthy enough to make those voyages. And I think voyages not only across the Atlantic, but across the Pacific to what we call the New World probably began in prehistoric times. And so that America was a crossroads for the world long before there ever was a Columbus, thousands of years before there ever was a Columbus. And there's nothing inherently impossible in terms of their level of science and technology and astronomical knowledge that would have prevented the ancient Egyptians from making such voyages.
The 6th dynasty spanned a period of 155 years. It marked the first time that large numbers of regional governors began to break away from the central rulership of the pharaoh to independently control their own territories. One of the most prominent pharaohs of this period was Pepi I, who quelled internal strife and strengthened the monarchy. His son, Pepi II, ruled Egypt for 94 years, the longest reign in world history. The death of Pepi II was followed by the decline of the 6th dynasty and the ultimate collapse of the Old Kingdom of Egypt. This then marked the end of 1,000 years of African splendor, the zenith of black civilizations, the world's first golden age. Let us now review how it all happened, how Egypt came to be a great African nation. First, black people from various parts of Africa migrated to the Upper Nile. There they founded the nation of Nubia. Then the Nubians moved down the Nile Valley and settled the land which was later to be called Egypt. They made many contributions to Egyptian civilization, including the divine kingship, mummification, a strong spiritual heritage, and perhaps even pyramid building. In time, however, Egypt evolved into a separate and distinct nation in its own right. A nation that laid the foundation of world civilization, but most especially, a nation that provided the roots for black history and culture. Egypt's great and ancient legacy remains with us today. This architecture, this science, this agriculture, these hieroglyphics, this legal system, these pyramids, these pharaohs, and these queens, are the great heritage of black people everywhere and have influenced the evolution of civilization around the world. Although its golden age had passed away, Black Egypt would indeed rise again in the Middle Kingdom, in the New Kingdom, and during the 25th dynasty. The entire ancient world would marvel at the resilience and power of these magnificent people. As the distinguished author Fleur Lugard has written, the annals of all of the great nations of Asia Minor are full of them. The Mosaic records allude to them frequently. But while they're described as the most powerful, the most just, and the most beautiful of the human race, they are constantly spoken of as black. And there seems to be no other conclusion to be drawn than that at that remote period of history, the leading race of the Western world was a black race. In subsequent episodes of the Clegg series, we shall explore Egypt's Middle Kingdom and world empire, the role of black women in antiquity, and black personalities of the Holy Bible. This concludes part 1 of the Clegg series, Egypt during the Golden Age.